Welcome to Asbestos Artifacts, where we take a look at some old asbestos products and dig a little bit into the story behind them. Today's asbestos artifact is a case of asbestos-lined sad irons. Now, what are sad irons? Well, as everyone knows, an iron is used to smooth wrinkles out of fabric. The heat of the iron will loosen the molecular bonds in the fabric, and the weight of the iron is what pushes them into alignment, so when the fabric cools, the wrinkle is gone. Now, some fabrics like cotton will need water to help loosen the bonds, which is why so many irons use steam. But before they had electric irons that had steam functions, blacksmiths made irons entirely out of metal. Some were just large flat metal plates known as flat irons. Now, the heavier an iron was, the more it could flatten something, but the heavier it was, the more difficult it would be to heat up and to wield it. Smaller, handheld irons were known as sad irons. Sad is an Old English word for solid. Sometimes they were called gooses because they had a gooseneck shape for the handle. The curved handle would keep your hand away from the hot iron. Now, the entire sad iron was made of metal, including the handle, so you had to wrap the handle in cloth or gloves, and this made them very cumbersome. They'd also have to be heated on a fire or a stove. Getting the right temperature was tricky because the iron had to be hot enough to flatten the wrinkles without burning the fabric. Heating could also take a while, and when the iron cooled, you had to wait and heat it again. But then, in 1870, a woman named Mary Florence Potts invented a sad iron with a removable wooden handle. She was actually only 19 years old at the time, but her sad irons with a removable handle became a huge success and they virtually revolutionized ironing. With Mary's sad iron, you could have two irons. One would be heating in the fire while you were using the other, and then when it cooled, you could swap them without having to let go of the handle. Many irons were pointed on one side to help iron around buttons, but Mary made sure that both sides were pointy and it became the standard for decades. So you've got each side here is pointy, and that was kind of her innovation. One limiting factor was that even a wooden handle could get hot, particularly because the hotter the iron got, the better it would do at smoothing wrinkles. And this is where asbestos comes in. In the late 1800s, two Norwegian guys, one was Charles Johnson Vey and the other was Ole Tverdal, patented a sad iron design that wrapped the handle in asbestos, insulating it from the heat of the sad iron. And the design was actually based on an idea by Tverdal's wife. Now, my asbestos iron kit came with some of the original asbestos cloth that was used to insulate the iron. Now, you can see here it looks very old and worn and frayed. Now, typically when cloth gets old and worn and frayed, you don't have anything to worry about, you just throw it away. But when asbestos gets frayed, it's going to put even more asbestos fibers in the air every time it's touched or manipulated or used. And the more asbestos fibers that go into the air, the more likely you are to breathe it. And that's where the problems come from. Let's see how these things actually work. So this is the sad iron itself, and this is probably about a 7 or 8 pound piece of cast iron. And you would take this and put it on some sort of fire or coals or a stove, whatever, to heat it up. So you could have a couple of these things heating up, and then this is the actual handle. And this is a mechanism where you switch this over, and that's how you lift it up and put it down. So I'll put this into the middle position. I can drop it on an iron, lock it into place, iron my clothes, and now if it's gotten cool, I can set it back down, pick it back up, and drop it on another one. So what I'll do here is I'm going to pretend that this is the asbestos cloth and put this down over the sad iron. I drop this down into place, flip the handle, and now I can iron. And the asbestos, if this was asbestos cloth, would be helping keep the heat from transferring from the iron itself into this metal that would then transfer up to there. So that's how the original asbestos sad irons would work. Now, asbestos, as you may know, is highly resistant to heat and was therefore used to fireproof all kinds of products, buildings, and vehicles. The manufacturers claimed that the handle could stay up to 15 degrees cooler than non-asbestos insulated sad irons. Apparently it worked because the product was extremely popular. The company was called Dover, and it employed 200 people, and they sold around 500,000 of these things annually. Their company even sold a kid's toy version, just like today if you go to a toy store they'll have toy versions of adult household tools. Of course, the problem with asbestos sad irons is that woven asbestos can release asbestos fibers into the air, especially after it gets worn and regularly used. These fibers can be breathed or swallowed, and they can become embedded in your tissue. Now, asbestos fibers have no taste or smell and can even be microscopic, so you won't know you're breathing them. As many studies indicate, asbestos fibers irritate, damage, and scar the tissue. After a while, maybe even 4 or 5 decades later, that asbestos exposure can lead to breathing problems and a number of diseases, including cancer. That's why asbestos manufacturing was banned from a lot of products, but some household products, older household products, will still have asbestos in them. So it's always a good idea to use proper protective clothing and gear when you're handling asbestos fabric to avoid exposure. The National Cancer Institute and many decades of health research has shown there is no known safe level of asbestos exposure. People who are exposed to asbestos in their 20s have developed asbestos-related illnesses 4 or even 5 decades later. So somebody ironing clothes in their 20s with one of these sad irons could have developed an asbestos-related disease 40 or 50 years later. Thank you for tuning in to Asbestos Artifacts. I look forward to seeing you next time, where we'll keep doing our deep dives into old products that used asbestos.